Anti-Imperialism. And we have no better guide today to the question of Lenin and anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism than Vijay Prashad. I think everybody knows his work and appreciates his both public commentary, his scholarly writings, his interventions in the public scene. I would give a shout out to at least two of what I consider to be some of his best essays, although it's hard to rank them. One is The Internationalist Lenin, Self-Determination and Anti-Colonialism. It's a real classic, one that I regularly teach. And also 100 Years Since We Lost Comrade Lenin. Both of these can be easily found online. But with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Vijay, who's going to share his thoughts on Lenin and anti-colonialism.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Gabriel. Yes, I very much hope that there'll be a statue in Central Park, but the statue must not just be a statue. It must be the advance of the class struggle in the United States, which is advancing quite rapidly. I saw in preparation that there's a new union of the United Auto Workers in the US South. I saw that the students in New York City have escalated their encampments against the genocidal war in Gaza and so on. Seems to be a lot of activity taking place in the United States itself, the most wretched of all imperialist centers. But I'll come back to that in a minute. Lenin is beloved to us. I was so horrified when I had a birthday and I discovered about 4 years ago that I'm now older than Lenin was when he died. Extraordinary people. Lenin, for instance, in the 50-some years of his life, produced not only an incredible body of work. Most intellectuals would be completely chuffed with themselves if they had half that body of work, the kind of theoretical interventions. But of course, he also led a revolution and then tried his very best to build a socialist state, one of the most difficult projects of the modern era, to build socialism within the context of imperialism and, of course, capitalism. Lenin, an extraordinary person in that short time, having done all those things, not one, not the other, but all of them, a range of them. The reason I said that last task of Lenin, building the state, how difficult that was, that's the reason why when I selected Lenin, more than half this book is in fact of Lenin post-revolution. Post-revolution, because that's the most important period in a way. Whereas on the question of liberalism, Lenin settled accounts with, one step forward, 2 steps back, and so on. He settled accounts with liberalism. He closed the debate for himself on the question of colonialism and capitalism. He closed that debate with development of capitalism in Russia. He made it very clear that under colonial and semi-colonial conditions, capitalism was not going to be able to advance. So which reason socialists had to fight on a double front. One, to immediately fight for national liberation, and secondly, to advance to socialism. You couldn't wait for capitalism to develop in the colonies, but he settled that in development of capitalism in Russia, one of his early texts, early main texts. He closed that debate in What Is to Be Done, which Leftward published with a great introduction by Prakash Karat. In What Is to Be Done, he settled the question of the nature of the party. What should a party be like? The importance of centralization, the importance of internal democracy, and then the importance of discipline. I've spoken a lot about how discipline in Lenin is misunderstood. Lenin didn't mean discipline as obedience. Lenin meant discipline as a trained political cadre, where the cadre would be politically educated sufficiently that they would be able to be, in a sense, replaceable, each cadre as conscious as the other of the path to build a revolution, and so on. Lenin closed that debate and discussion. The one debate and discussion which he didn't close was the issue of building the socialist project afterwards. His struggles were incomplete. He died, only in fact, 6 years after the victory of the Soviet Republic and then the USSR, which is why his last several texts on cooperatives, his last text, Better, Fewer but Better, and so on, are so essential, because Lenin is trying to start theorizing. It's only a beginning. Start theorizing about the limitations of building socialism. It wasn't the culmination of a period. He was in the middle of theorizing. It's very interesting to go back and read Lenin. I'm constantly taking out volume 33 to have a read again of those texts. I'm going to be editing 3 of the most important last writings of Lenin to think about this incomplete nature of his critique of the process of building a socialist state project. Incomplete for Lenin. The one text which is treated as complete, which I think is a great error in our tradition, is his short pamphlet on imperialism, which is why I'm going to spend about 20 minutes on that, and then we can have a discussion. I'm sorry I caught a cold while I was running around in the Pacific region, trying to do a story on US military bases. I caught a terrible cold. I can tell you one thing, it's not COVID, although colds and COVID till now are not spread through Zoom. So that's a good thing. But who knows? Who knows what technology they've devised to get us all sick? Anyway, Lenin's text on imperialism, it wasn't a theoretical summation of what imperialism is. The text is very important. It's a key text for Lenin and for the Leninist tradition. But it's not a summation of the theory of imperialism. The text imperialism is a conjunctural text. It's written for a moment. And so I want to pick that up today. There are, in one sense, I'm saying 2 incomplete projects from Lenin. One is the project of the critique of the socialist construction project. Lenin was undertaking that, the experiences they were accumulating, what they were learning in the process of building socialism, how Lenin was learning about the cultural deficiencies, that it's not enough to just dismiss the argument that people are not greedy. When a capitalist or bourgeois economist says that human personality is founded on greed, and therefore the utility calculations are based on greed. What's the best I can get out of an interaction, the demand and supply curve, and so on, that rooted in a psychosocial perspective of greed. It's not possible just to dismiss that and say, well, people are more complicated than greed. The cultures of capitalism exist within us. How are you going to build socialism through that culture? That's the kind of stuff Lenin was thinking about in his last years. So, as I said, that's an incomplete project. But equally incomplete in a different way is the question of imperialism. That's incomplete in a different way because Lenin didn't attempt to write a general theory of imperialism. That's not what he was writing. There's no tendency in Lenin's work, whether it's the 1916 text, which was eventually published, or work before and after. There is no expectation in Lenin's letters or writing that he was writing a general theory of imperialism. He was writing a conjunctural text about imperialism. And so I'm going to go into what that conjuncture was that he was interested in and why he wrote that text, number one. Secondly, I'm going to periodize imperialism because I believe that since Lenin's writings, there have been 4 periods. And then I'm going to spend a little time on the last, let's not call it a period, but it's the stage of what we in our institute are calling hyper-imperialism. I'm going to try to explain that. There's nothing heretical about saying there are periods, precisely because Lenin didn't propose a general theory of imperialism. Okay? So that's what I'm going to do for the next 20 odd minutes. Number one, Lenin was interested, sitting in Switzerland, in why World War I, or what was then the Great War, why World War I transpired, and why did the social democratic forces, the forces that had taken to Marxism, such as the German Social Democratic Party, people like, the great deputies of that party in the German Reichstag. Why did the forces of social democracy, influenced by Marxism, certainly interpreted by Karl Kautsky, why did that political force, why did those forces then support that Great War? What was the reason for the Great War? That was the compelling question that was sitting on Lenin's head while he was in Switzerland in the period of the war. He was greatly unhappy with the fact of the war. In fact, that's the reason why he called the few handful of people, his allies, to Zimmerwald for the famous conversation about the state of the socialist movement. And that's the reason why Rosa Luxemburg so compellingly said that workers of the world unite during peacetime. During war, they slit each other's throats. Very beautiful line to explain the kind of inter-working class fratricide that was taking place in that great war. It was to explain that war that Lenin went to Hobson, went to all the other 180 some texts that he read on imperialism to understand why that war. In other words, the answer to the question why that war is the pamphlet on imperialism. The pamphlet on imperialism was not written to answer the question, what is imperialism? Eternal. What is imperialism in concept? That was not why he went to that text. He went to that text to answer the question, why this war? Why are the workers slitting each other's throats? And what he then understood is important. He understood that there were several centers of imperialist ambition to go and colonize various parts of the world. Within the nature of capitalism, there was a tendency to monopolies. These monopolies were not satisfied with the territory of their country. They needed more markets, more raw materials, more space. There was a special aspect to this. They needed to go out and conquer the world. These companies did. And they required the help of their governments. And so there became a kind of complex between company and government. And this is the reason why, as companies, as an inter-capitalist global conflict erupted, that inter-capitalist global conflict had an inter-imperialist character. And the war was a reflection of that character. In fact, the war starts in 1914 and doesn't end till 1945. There's a slight interregnum. There really isn't World War I and World War II. It's the same war. They are fighting over the same kind of dilemma faced by the centers of imperialist ambition. That is their dilemma, how for their companies, as they began to become near monopolies, how that monopoly tendency was clashing against companies in other territories. That inter-imperialist crisis becomes an inter-capitalist crisis becomes an inter-imperialist war. That is what Lenin writes about in his text on imperialism. It's about the conjuncture. It's a conjunctural analysis of the moment, of that phase of imperialism. You see, you can go back. If you read Giovanni Arrighi's work, you can go back and you can make the argument that there were earlier times. And Arrighi makes an interesting but little functional argument that the Italian city-states had a smaller territory of imperial conquest, but they lasted a long time. And then as they moved from productive investments, whether mercantile or even to some extent proto-industrial, to finance, then capital moves to the Low Countries, to Amsterdam, where the Dutch have a slightly larger territory than the Italians that they conquer in the world. But then there's still lots of room for other centers of ambition to emerge, but they last for a smaller amount of time. And then finance leaps to London. That's what Giovanni Arrighi argues. English have a much larger territory of conquest, but again, not the whole planet. And then they last slightly shorter than the Dutch imperial center. And eventually, finance leaps to Wall Street, which has an ambition of conquering the whole world, and so on. You can take Arrighi's historical argument and map it to Lenin's conjuncture. It fits perfectly okay. There's no real disagreement. But I want to insist that what Lenin is doing is not developing a general theory of imperialism. That's a misreading of that text. Lenin is attempting to analyze why this long war starts 1914, ends long after his death, 1945. Why this war? Why does the tendency to monopoly of firms in capitalism lead to inter-capitalist conflict across borders, which then transmutes, becomes inter-imperialist conflict? That's Lenin's text. That's one phase of modern imperialism. In a conjunctural sense, I'm using the word phase. Okay, in a sense of the conjuncture. The conjuncture changes with the defeat of the fascists in 1945, or at least, if I can pretend to be theoretical, the sublation of the fascists in 1945, because they were not really defeated. The sublation of the fascists in 1945. Then a new phase opens, the new conjuncture in the history of modern imperialism. This phase runs from 1945 to about 1990-91. What is this phase? The world is divided into three major units. A capitalist bloc, let's call it what it called itself, the West, the bloc of quote-unquote capitalism and freedom. That was one bloc. Within that bloc, the United States played a key role in attempting to subordinate Europe. The instruments of subordination principally was NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded in 1949. The military bases in Germany and Italy. The attempt by the French to have an independent foreign policy was cut back by the United States. Inter-imperialist conflict within the region of the West was muted, and it has been set to mute for a very long time. There were some inter-capitalist problems, of course, but they didn't raise to an inter-imperialist conflict. Okay? I mean, it is really quite remarkable that from 1945 till now, 2024, Germany and France haven't gone to war. It's the longest period in the entire pre-modern to modern era that Germany and France haven't been at war. It is incredible. If you just go back from 1945 backwards, 150 years, Germany and France are almost always at war. Whether it's, the Napoleonic Wars, Bismarck, and so on, the Germans coming in, crushing the Paris Commune, 1871, and so on. The longest period, no war between France and Germany. Almost the inter-capitalist conflict, almost not allowed to become an inter-imperialist conflict. The imperial ambitions of different places brought to heel for maybe united reasons. We'll come back to that later. So the second phase is when the West confronts something called the East, the socialist project, and confronts something called the Third World. And its primary ambition is to unite itself against these two adversaries. Now, the East was not an imperialist bloc. It had no ambition to conquer the world. It had an ambition to create world socialism. That's different than world conquest. The West continued to harbor ambition of world conquest, but it was held back by the two blocs. On the one side, the Soviet-led socialist bloc, and the Third World bloc. So this is the second phase in the history of modern imperialism, a phase which was, in a sense, where the West and East held each other off. And to some extent, there were proxy battles in the Third World. But the Third World was not just a battlefield. It itself was a project which attempted to push against The West certainly, but also the East in a different way. That's the second phase of modern imperialism. Again, in a conjunctural sense. The third phase, in a conjunctural sense, was from 1991, roughly till the Third Great Depression. That was 2008 onwards. This phase is interesting. This phase is when the United States, having seen the Soviet Union self-destruct, in fact, commit suicide, led by renegades, Yeltsin, Gorbachev, renegade people who, in fact, didn't need to shut the Soviet Union down, but made a political decision. The Soviet Union didn't collapse in and of itself. It was politically assassinated. It was closed down in 1991. Um, from that period onward, the United States attempted, in a way, the ambition of controlling the whole world, first among equals, blah, 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 primus inter pares. Attempted, I say, because it didn't succeed. It wasn't able to succeed. Even in that period, there were always what it called rogue states. The DPRK on the Korean Peninsula, Iran, Syria, etc. Countries that just were not willing to submit to the United States. Rogue states, Cuba, then the emergence in South America of the Bolivarian Project, Venezuela, the Nicaraguans are strengthened, unwilling to submit, and so on. But this third period of what sometimes is called US unipolarity is a period of great imperial overreach. This is a term from bourgeois writers, imperial overreach, not from us, but it's correct. The United States, for instance, starts escalating military spending and basically cuts down its tax system so that it doesn't, in fact, produce a system where it's able to use wealth, use its considerable wealth to build a strategic domination of the world. In fact, the domination of the world becomes mostly military and not so much by building projects to assist even the bourgeoisie in the global south. Partly because it's said to its own elites, you don't need to pay taxes. You can offshore your money and whatever remains of its resources put into the military in order to vanquish those rogue states, those holdouts. Enormous military spending to tackle them, to prevent new rivals from emerging, and so on. All of that jettisons capitalism into the Third Great Depression. Why the Third Great Depression? The First Great Depression, global depression, late 19th century. The spur of all three depressions is in the United States. It's interesting. It's a railway bust in the late 19th century. Second Great Depression, the Wall Street collapse, 1929. That depression goes from 29 till about 1945. It's through military spending that the United States recovers its immense economic growth in the so-called Golden Age. But the Third Great Depression takes place due to the housing market collapse in the US, from which capitalist economies have not recovered. Latest study from the IMF shows that. In fact, they talk about this non-stop austerity program, that the only reason money remains sound is because of austerity. Living standards have declined one way or the other. It's not just the COVID pandemic, or it's not just the war in Ukraine. It's a long-term problem that goes back to the start of the second decade of this century. So from the Third Great Depression onward, we've entered a new phase. What is this new phase of imperialism? You see, I want to stop for a second and say, is it heretical? Is it heretical to say that there are four conjunctural moments? Is it anti-Leninist to say there are four conjunctural moments? I don't think so. I think, in fact, from Lenin's perspective, these conjunctural analyses of each of the moments is precisely the method of Marxism, Leninism. It's precisely the method. Lenin was a great contributor to the importance of the conjunctural analysis. You see that in a lot of his writings. So what is the nature of the conjuncture from the Third Great Depression's inauguration onwards. It's interesting to look at that because it's from around that period that you see Russia and China emerge as major powers, but not alone. India's economy starts to grow. Indonesia, Nigeria. Right now the IMF has said Nigeria slipped to the fourth largest economy in Africa. That's only because of currency devaluation. In fact, Nigeria's economy remains quite big. That doesn't mean they've dealt with inequality in any of these countries, but the economies are growing, which is unlike the situation in the West, the epicenter of the Third Great Depression. So from this period onwards, the global North has come to understand that it is losing that control that it's had for hundreds of years. And therefore, it is putting more eggs into the basket of the military than less. It is militarizing all of diplomacy. Unable to build bridges, it wants to blow them up or threaten to blow them up. That's a key point. In this text, Hyper-Imperialism, we demonstrate that world military spending, today SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute, released their report. They say, oh, world military spending up to 2 trillion. They have been under pressure to up their numbers because it's hugely deflated. We show, looking at the numbers closely, that US military spending by itself is not 900 billion, as SIPRI says, but 1.53 trillion, because we've added in nuclear spending. The United States, the NATO countries, and the near NATO allies, Korea and Japan, you put them all together, they account for 75% of global military spending. This is at a scale that is much larger than anything in the previous phases of modern imperialism. This is nothing like what it was in 1916. It would not be recognizable to Lenin. 75%. The West, controlling a lot of communications channel, argues China is a threat. China's share of global military spending is 10%. 75% over here, 10% over here. It's a ridiculous divergence. There are actual so-called leftists around the world who talk about inter-imperialist conflict between Russia, China, United States. They have lost their mind. They don't understand the actual facts of the situation. In fact, in our argument in this text, China and Russia are defensive powers. These are not aggressive powers. There is only one aggressive core in this period, and that is the United States-led core. It is hyper-imperialism because there's a kinetic character to it. It's kinetic. There is an understanding that the whole world is nails and you have the biggest hammer. There is no attempt to go out there and do development projects. The United States doesn't have the funds for it. Rather than contest the Chinese, for instance, in countries in Africa on commercial terms, they make threats about how China is, a national security threat to Zambia or to Ghana or whatever. The United States has a plethora of military bases on the African continent, but they will say that China is the military threat, but it has no military posture, merely commercial. If you want to contest them commercially, contest them, but they don't have the means. They only have the means to militarize the conflict. So in that sense, it's hyper-imperialist. There's a kinetic character. Every conflict or every sense of political retreat that the United States faces, it militarizes it. And in fact, this has become the case globally, inclusive in Europe. The war in Ukraine, yes, of course, the Russians crossed the line into Ukraine, but this is not a Russian war. This is a war that the United States through NATO provoked, going back to the Maidan, going back to the United States unilateral withdrawal from the mid-range nuclear missile treaty. Unilateral withdrawal. The danger of placing missiles in Taiwan or placing missiles in Ukraine inflames the borders of Russia and China. Inflames those borders. This is a hyper-imperialist conflict imposed on countries like Russia and China. There is no inter-imperialist crisis. So to take Lenin's conjunctural analysis, an analysis born out of a conjuncture, make a general theory out of it, and then take the general theory and plonk it onto our period, is decisively anti-Leninist. You are not honoring Lenin by doing the exact opposite methodologically that Lenin did in 1916 when he put out his pamphlet. He was trying to analyze the conjuncture. You cannot make a general theory out of a conjunctural analysis without mediation. You have to take a conjunctural analysis and build a theory and see if it applies to other conjunctures. Not take an analysis of a conjuncture and pretend that it's a general theory. And I'm surprised to see Marxists of great intelligence missing the very simple point that Lenin's text is a text of a conjuncture. And therefore, we are under an obligation to honor the great Lenin. We are under an obligation not to merely repeat Lenin's conjuncture without a detailed analysis of the concrete conditions. Because without a detailed analysis of the concrete conditions, we will not be building theory from the facts. And if you don't build theory from the facts, you will make important strategic and tactical errors. And that is precisely what sectarian sections of the international left have been doing. Not building theory from the facts and therefore making significant strategic, programmatic, strategic, and tactical errors. We honor Lenin by honoring Lenin, not by treating Lenin like a religious god. Lenin was our comrade. Lenin was our comrade. He is a human being. He is with us still in his work, but he's not a god. He is not the 11th avatar. He is a human being. We must build from Lenin, not stay at Lenin. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Vijay. That was excellent. And I have one comment and question to get things started. The first comment has to do with the powerful appeal that you make to a dialectical form of history that's rooted in conjunctural analysis. And I really appreciated the way in which you distinguish between these four different phases that you began by saying there were periods, but ultimately I take it that the way that you understand them is that a phase has its own temporality to it. So it doesn't function like a bourgeois history textbook in which all of a sudden from day one to day two, you change an epoch overnight. These are complex processes that are dialectically intertwined, and they also vary depending on space and social stratification, right? And that allows us then to do a level of conjunctural analysis that pushes back against what I take to be a kind of critique of idealist history. Idealist history, you assume that there are these fixed epochs, or you do a cut and paste job where you say, well, Lenin said this then, we'll just cut and paste this and use the same ideal framework to apply to different material contexts. And so I really appreciate the way in which you're encouraging us to engage with Lenin as someone who was a methodological Marxist, right? He wasn't putting forth dogma. He wasn't simply repeating what Marx and Lenin said. I'm sorry, what Marx and Engels said, my bad. He was also very clearly in the text on imperialism saying, I disagree with Marx and Engels because on the Polish question, for instance, because they were writing at a different time. And at our time, we need a different form of analysis. So in relationship to your encouragement to think dialectically and conjuncturally, and to approach Leninism as a methodology, not as something like a sacrosanct dogma, I'm curious if you could relate particularly your later comments about hyper-imperialism, and obviously you're drawing on the text that I'd encourage everyone to read, published by Tricontinental on precisely that topic, is that Lenin said, quote, that imperialism as the highest or latest stage in the development of capitalism creates the objective conditions for the achievement of socialism, right? And towards the end of your text, you begin to allude to this But given everything that you've just mapped out for us about the kind of dwindling unipolar world, the reliance on militarism, the attempt on the part of the US empire to revive itself and rev the engine of neo-imperialism just as it's kind of running out of gas, do you see hyper-imperialism and this moment creating the objective conditions for the achievement of socialism, like Lenin saw that in an earlier phase that was very, very different? So I'm curious your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's a great question, well formulated question. I mean, the first thing is, I think the objective conditions for socialism have been with us for a while. Um, in terms of a couple of things. One is the massive generation of wealth has been with us for a while. We generate on the planet massive amount of goods and services that could cover the needs of people doublefold. Incredible productive capacity generated by capitalism in our time. That's one form. The second is that our scientific and technological prowess has increased incredibly. Like the fact that we can hold this meeting in this form, unimaginable in my own lifetime. And I'm only 56 years old. To even have imagined as a 20-something-year-old that I could be looking at there were no laptop compute, there were no desktop computers when I was in college. There was no personal computer when I was in college. And look at the technological changes that enabled us in this pandemic, for instance, to maintain contact for long periods of time without seeing other people and so on. In the early pandemics, people had to write letters and whatnot. Even then, in places, the post was closed. People were genuinely isolated. I mean, the technological developments are immense. I once talked to a computer engineer who told me that the technology, the calculating capacity in a smartphone is greater than some of the computers in the Soviet Union that they were using to develop better understanding of the way goods and services were being distributed. I mean, imagine what companies like Amazon and so on are able to do with logistics, the advances in logistics that could enable planning. So remarkable. So the objective conditions to build a socialist society have, I think, long been achieved. It's the subjective side where we have a great problem. Just as the objective conditions were achieved, and in a sense, precisely because of the way the objective conditions were achieved. In other words, the breakdown of trade unionism, the disarticulation of factories, all of that enabled production to go to a scale unimaginable. The ruthless exploitation of labor allowed the objective conditions to be achieved. But that very possibility of achieving the objective conditions made the subjective side much harder. That it's hard to achieve trade unionism across a sector, across continents and so on, even with this technology. It's very difficult. The cars are built in 8 countries. How are you going to have 8 factories, 10, 15 factories go on strike at the same time to hit that automaker? Their vulnerabilities their risk has been distributed much more, cleverly. So the subjective side is much weaker now. Our confidence in the subjective transformation is much lessened. So in the short period ahead, I doubt that we'll have major socialist breakthroughs. I doubt it. I think what you're going to have in the short period ahead is the return of forms of social democracy, center-left kind of politics. We have entered the era where I feel the center-left is going to have some sort of return, because the far right and the neoliberal right don't have the capacity to deal with real compelling problems in the world. And it's very hard to build the left. I think we're going to have to go through another period of the forces of, kind of humane nationalism emerging again. New governments coming on the African continent already signal that. The governments in the Sahel region, Ibrahim Traore, he's not a socialist, but these are humane people who want to help their people. And we are going to enter a period of this. And it is precisely as we enter a period of this that the left has to be absolutely vigilant, building theory from the facts, out there driving both a left agenda, but not being sectarian towards these humane forces, whatever you want to call them. We can't be sectarian against them, which is why in our text we talk about rings. We say there are some countries that are, strongly, we have these funny little rings here, we divide the world up into rings. We do an assessment. Where is Algeria today? Where is this country? Where is that country? Because I think there's a great need to understand, in a way, the different ways in which new humane forces will make an appearance. And as these humane forces make an appearance, what should be the attitude of the left toward them? If in Indonesia, for instance, you're not going to have a big socialist project in Indonesia, but if some form of humane nationalism comes, which is not from the right, either far right-wing nationalism or neoliberal forms of politics, how do we assess that? That's going to be the tendency that we're going to see in many countries, already seeing them. I mean, in South Asia, for instance, in a way, the most recent incarnation of Imran Khan was that, a sort of, nationalism which suggested we got to take care of people's needs. For which reason he said, I can't cut with Russia. And then he had to be removed. What does the left do with that form of thing? Then there are strongly sovereign-seeking countries like Iran. What should be the left's relationship with strongly sovereign-seeking countries like Iran? It's not a socialist country. It's a theocracy, self-declared theocracy. What should be the relation? That is the analysis we have to be in now, not looking for pure socialism. It never comes in a pure form. Never. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. It does make me think, and I'd like to hear you on this, but it's not my primary question, is that there is a lot of debate about the global rise of fascism and the way in which the heavily militarized US leader of global empire has been supporting that around the world, if it be using Ukraine as an international hub for fascists, if it be Israel, if it be Milei in Argentina, Modi in India. This is obviously a very big debate. And so I'd be curious to hear you a little bit more on the kind of sharpening of the contradictions of hyper-imperialism. But actually, my principal question goes to the final thing that you said, and that is how we understand the emergence of these projects of national self-determination that clearly aren't socialist, but they're anti-imperialist. And it strikes me that there's an interesting parallel with Lenin, and in particular, some of your writings on Lenin where you bring this out, because Lenin theorized a dialectical relationship between projects of national self-determination on the one hand and the internationalist socialist project on the other, and encouraged us to go in neither of those directions, right? In the sense that if we just support all nationalisms, we're going to fall into social chauvinism, etc. If we just support internationalism now, then we fall into a kind of ultra-leftism that is unmoored from material reality. If we take that not as a framework that we would cut and paste and apply to contemporary reality, but as a method of analysis, do you think that in the contemporary world that many will describe as multipolar, that a leftist position that is coherent would consist in saying that, well, we should tactically support national struggles for liberation from imperialism, even if they're not socialist, because they break certain chains of imperialism, while nonetheless wanting to connect them as much as possible to an international socialist project. So in the case of a place like Iran or Russia, we might have tactical support, but not strategic support, because at the end of the day, we don't want a multipolar world, we want a socialist world. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on these debates, both on fascism and then the contemporary standing of the kind of multipolar world and how we should situate ourselves both tactically and strategically in relationship to it.
Yeah, the first thing is that I generally don't accept the use of the term populist, and I noticed you didn't really use that term either, to define like a Millet or a Trump or people like that. I mean, they're not populists. In fact, there's a lot that unites Millet to, other just run-of-the-mill neoliberals in places like Argentina, Macri, for instance, a run-of-the-mill neoliberal. Or Trump and Biden. There's a lot that unites them. They have a difference of attitude, and in some regard, a difference in their attitude towards society. They're harsher towards society and so on. But in terms of policy, it's pretty much along the same grain. Where's the difference between Trump and Biden on economic policy? Biden is as, in a sense, insular with economic policy. He also wanted to attempt, what was Bidenomics, attempt to onshore production, bring, chip production to the United States. It's very similar to Trump. The question of why it goes to this neo-fascist kind of tendencies is because in many countries, particularly in the global north, just to leave it there for now, in many countries in the global north, in an electoral democracy, it's very difficult to motivate people into a right-wing project unless you motivate them emotionally somehow. You can't go out there and say, look, vote for me, I'm going to make significant cuts. But if you say, vote for me, I, like you, hate immigrants, I, like you, hate XYZ, I, like you, am motivated by all these emotional things, and by the way, I'm going to close down all these ministries, you've built a mass base for yourself. If you just say, I'm going to close down all these ministries, might not have a mass base. So the nature of this neo-fascism is often to continue to pursue neoliberal policy agenda, but to build a mass base for it at a time when it's almost impossible to build that. The earlier era when Clinton could come out there and build a mass base for neoliberalism doesn't exist now. Now you have to build a mass base for neoliberalism on a different foundation, on an emotional foundation against immigrants or whatever, where between the far right and the center right, there's very little difference on that, except of tone and so on. Tone is a big thing. It's not a nothing, and so on. In terms of the strongly seeking countries, seeking national, some sovereignty, state sovereignty, Iran is a great example to continue with. Look, it's very clear that all socialists must be against imperialist war against Iran. I think there should be unanimity of opinion. When people of the left say, hey, listen, Saddam Hussein is a fascist, we should support the US bombing of Iraq, that's a position without conscience. That is not a left position. Left position must always stand against an imperialist war. The United States doesn't want to bomb Iran to get rid of the theocracy per se. It wants to get rid of Iran because Iran is a strongly seeking sovereignty country. That's its problem. What unites the rogue states, okay, so-called rogue states, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and Iran. DPRK is not theocratic. Iran is theocratic. And yet the United States has the same attitude toward them. What brings them together is they both seek strong sovereignty. They don't want to allow their sovereignty to be compromised. That's what the US is after. And the anti-imperialist forces should always defend a country's right to sovereignty. Now, having defended its right to sovereignty, it doesn't stop there. You have to build and make alliances and attempt to move those strongly seeking sovereign countries in a direction which is progressive. But there's also a time for that. You don't have to do everything at the same time. See, one problem, Gabriel, that has taken place amongst prominent people of the left, and there are quite a few of them, is that they always want to appear to be personally above reproach and correct on everything. So they always want to say everything. That is not a socialist's attitude. A socialist takes their time. They bide their time. I don't feel the need to at all times say everything I believe in order for people to like me personally. That is not relevant. That is egotistical. That is a leftist individualism and egotism. There are things I believe I'm not going to talk about because there is always a moment in time. If you want to open a certain debate, there's a time to open the debate. Right now is not the time, for instance, to open a debate about Iran's theocracy. This is not the time. This is the time to defend its right to be a strongly sovereign country. But there is a kind of left intellectual arrogance, individualistic arrogance, which says, I should say everything, I should launch all attacks because I want to be personally thought of as a correct person on all counts. And that is given the name of integrity. This is very, very bad practice for left intellectuals. This idea that, somehow it is integrity to attack everybody. No, this is politically foolish. And also it's egotistical. It's not integrity. Integrity is to subordinate yourself into the real historical process and to allow yourself to be in that process trying to build a better world, not to stand away from the process and be like old prophets from a mountain declaring everybody to be wrong and you alone to be right. That is arrogance. That's egotism. So that I would come to the Iran question on that. This is not the moment to launch a full-scale attack on the Iranian government, whatever your reservations about it.
Thank you, Vijay. I think we'll turn it over to Sandeep for the who's going to moderate some of the other questions coming in from the chat.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, both of you. Wonderful lecture, as always. Before moving over to the question and answer section, we have with us Dr. Chirosri Dasgupta from JNU. We are going to ask her for her comments. If she could, Chirosri, I am unmuting you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Vijay. I am just amazed at how you could speak with such energy despite that cold. But then I've seen you speak in very difficult circumstances before, and I know how you manage that and with Elan. I was thinking of a couple of points, not very elaborate, as there are other questions that you have to answer. But the first one was that if we go by this question of conjunctural analysis, but based on what would be a Leninist method, which I do not think is a wrong formulation, if I may put forward. In that, there are certain things that were part of that conjunctural analysis that made up the text of imperialism, the high stage of capitalism. And one was a very detailed, the first was from a historical materialist perspective, a very detailed account of the relationship between corporations across countries, within countries, and the relationship with their respective nation states. Now, does the conjunctural analysis that you are offering for the rest of these periods since 1945 throw light on this aspect of what I would insist would be a part of a Leninist method? The second is about I'm intrigued why you consider 1991 to 2008 as a particular phase, because why wouldn't 1973, for example, and the dislodging of the sort of the and what started in Chile be the moment from which we would consider this second phase, because the rise of neoliberal as an ideology driving material transformations in various societies, either through imposition or through like different kind of one section of the bourgeoisie really wanting to align with imperialism. Both of these processes start much before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I am not sure by 1991 the kind of formal collapse of the Soviet Union would be the uh, mm, departure. As a historian, like I would really um, need like demand from you a more uh, argued demarcation of the period. And the last one is that if it is that uh, neo-fascism is just sort of a tactic more than a like a phase uh, in the history of imperialism, because unlike fascisms of the 20th century or the early to mid 20th centuries, which were largely located in Europe and in the in the heart of the imperial north, neo-fascism seemed to have uh, uh, sort of proliferated much beyond that uh, core. So what is it that then, like, are these neo-fascisms then simply a tactic, as you seem to suggest, in implementing neoliberalism, or is there something more structural in terms of the relationship between social conflict and neoliberalism, which creates both the objective and the subjective conditions for the rise of neo-fascism? Thank you.
What completely rich things to think about. In fact, I'm going to just put it into two buckets because I think the first 2 points are related on corporate state and the periodization, and then the second on neo-fascism. You know, when we studied fascism, we were always taught that fascism was a response by the bourgeoisie to the rise of the left. And as the left forces, and I don't just mean the communists, I mean trade union movements, peasant movements, and so on. You know, Mussolini was a reaction to the Turin strikes, or that Hitler's rise and the support from the bourgeoisie to the German Nazis was because of the rise of the communists and the rise of the trade union movement in Germany. So the strength of the workers' movement after the Russian Revolution, the threat of the Soviet Union, the rise of the workers' movement, in a way moves the bourgeoisie to say, let's get rid of the face of liberalism and go straight into this kind of iron fist. And that's how we were taught the history of fascism, that fascism emerges politically to defend the bourgeoisie against the rise of the left, whether internationally with the Soviet Union or with the workers' movement. But in a sense, I remember having so many hours of conversation with Ejaz Ahmed about this, because the emergence of neo-fascism, let's say, you know, with forces like, we also have to actually be very precise about this, because the situation in Eastern Europe is different from, you know, the countries like the United States or France and Italy and so on. And then it's certainly different from what happens in India and Turkey and other countries, you know, in Argentina. In a way, they each have their own particularities, national. Then there are the particularities of North and South. And then there are the particularities of East and West. And I think, you know, sometimes we just sort of generalize without thinking through these particularities. Like, for instance, a lot of Eastern European neo-fascism is a response to the humiliation of what happened to them post collapse of the Soviet Union. Many of these forces, Orban is an example. Many of these people were leaders of the movements against the state communist governments. And they initially championed liberal democracy and so on. And they see that, in fact, what happened to them was a kind of colonization, most dramatically in East Germany. They were colonized by the West. And then their kind of quote unquote, social conservatism is a kind of nationalist assertion, inclusive in Russia, where, Putin's parties, the names of the parties, United Russia and so on, are all deeply nationalistic. There's something about the humiliation of 91 that they are trying to recover from. That's different from, let's say, the Trumps and the Le Pens and others, who have a different problem. So anyway, one is that I don't think we sufficiently analyze the different moments of this. Modi's story is different from Trump. To put them together, I think misses a lot. And they are also both different from Netanyahu. So there's that national, then there's some regional differences, and then there's the differences of also timing and so on. But something does unite them all. And one of the things that unites them all on the social level is a critique of being the detritus of neoliberalism. All of them in different ways are being able to pick up people who feel left out, and they have been able to create a politics of abandonment much more than the left, inclusive of Modi. The attack on the Congress party is an attack on the idea that the Congress has abandoned large sections of the Indian public, and they understand that abandonment communally. And so in the United States, they understand the abandonment racially. Trump will talk about the abandoned populations and so on. This neo-fascism emerges in a way as the double of neoliberalism. It's both produced by it and it's its great defender. But it's not a critique of it. It doesn't come to defend the bourgeoisie, because the bourgeoisie doesn't need a defense, which is why it doesn't need to overthrow constitutions. You don't have the March on Rome. You don't have, the burning of the Reichstag. You don't need that. You can win elections. So this neo-fascism politically has a very different character. It is the double of neoliberalism. It emerges by picking up the victims of neoliberalism and reinterpreting their victimhood, not as they're treating them not as victims of neoliberalism, but as victims of the political forces that champion neoliberalism. So they therefore protect neoliberalism from critique. The problem isn't liberalization, it's the Congress. The problem isn't, the Clinton reforms, it's Clinton, and so on. And they build their politics in this doubled form. So that, in that sense, in my opinion, neo-fascism is to some extent a tactic. It's not the same as, let's say, the fascism, classical fascism. It doesn't require that kind of analysis. It requires a different kind of analysis, in my opinion. But again, I'm willing to concede that it's more than a tactic. I just feel that it's a tactic. It will require a lot more assessment about whether the double of neoliberalism is more than merely a tactical way to continue the neoliberal project when it has actually exhausted itself politically. Yeah, that's the point that I'm trying to make about that neoliberalism exhausted itself, but it is continuing, and it's continuing through its double, which is the neo-fascist. I think your points about corporate-state relation and 73-91 are excellent points, and it actually carries within it the limitations always of my own analysis, which is often leaning more towards the political than the economic. And that is a limitation I generally have. And I think you've identified it very clearly and correctly. Now, it's not enough to say that and then walk away. let me reflect on what you said. In a way, periods are developed, to help us understand a conjuncture. And it's quite possible. And perhaps I'm going to learn from this point you've made, particularly the second point about 73, that maybe there are two beginnings for that period. Maybe that period has two beginnings. There is a beginning in the 1970s. There is a beginning that inaugurates the kind of neoliberal policy agenda, but not yet with the political confidence that comes after 91. Because in a way, the coup in Chile required a coup to enforce neoliberalism. But after 1991, they created the World Trade Organization, which they had failed to create in 1948. And in 1994, countries willingly walked into the World Trade Organization. In fact, they wanted to join with great enthusiasm. You needn't have had a coup in 94 to do that, except amongst the rogue states, so-called rogue states. Their coup d'etats or attempted coups continue, but by and large, there was no need. So I'm going to take from what you've said about 73, and I think I'm going to use it to enrich some of this argumentation. I think it's very valuable what you said, but I would still say that there can be two different starting points for a period. Maybe we can be dialectical about that, that in that early starting point, they still had to utilize great force to force countries into the force of bourgeoisie into, into entering a kind of different understanding of state corporate relations. Whereas by the 90s, the bourgeoisie was enthusiastic about that. And that had to do with the political dynamic having changed, the collapse of the USSR and so on. I think it's also correct that we need more analysis. And Chirashri, who made the comments own book on India and the corporates, is a very valuable contribution to this. I think we need much more analysis of the move from nation-based firms in the modern era to multinational corporations and the relationship between this form of business enterprise, not only in terms of operating in different countries, which has, of course, got a much longer history, but having productive units be in many countries. I think this changes the underlying basis of the conjunctures. And it's interesting that it's in this, this conjuncture, which starts in 73 and 91, that you have the both the beginning of the Center for Transnational Corporations in the UN to monitor transnational corporations and its closure in 1992 with immense pressure from the US government. Why did the US government put so much pressure to shut down Center for Transnational Corporations? Because it didn't want any scrutiny or regulation of these multi-sited production-oriented multinational corporations, not just where they have different headquarters, maybe commercial interests, sales interests, service thing, but where productive units, having been disarticulated, made these companies global corporations, not just multinational corporations, but global corporations. And I think underneath the analysis of the conjuncture, different conjunctural moments, it could be useful to have a layer of conversation about the changing shape of these large corporations that move from nation-based, multi-sited, mercantilist type companies to the global corporation. I think it actually doesn't provide any contradiction in my mind already. I can see how it would fit well with this conjunctural analysis. So thanks a lot for that first point. I think it's so important.
Thank you, Vijay. I think like we would love to go through the question answer session. We have a few questions, but I think we are running out of time as we have spoken earlier due to time constraint. I don't think we will be able to take questions right now. But if Gabriel and Vijay you agrees, then we will send you the questions, email you the questions, and we will send the replies to those who have asked those questions. If I have your permission. then I will proceed. Okay. Gabriel, you have any comments, like end comments about the whole session?
Well, I think it was a very rich session, brought up a lot of food for thought. And I think that my main takeaway, and I think what is so important for everybody on the call, is using Leninism as a methodology for an analysis of specific conjunctures. And what I really appreciated as well was the actuality of Lenin, right? We're here to celebrate his birth date, and Lenin continues to kind of be reborn in the ongoing pursuit of the method of Leninism as a very specific dialectical and conjunctural modality of analysis that ultimately is geared not to us simply being theoretically right about the world. The reason to elucidate and be right about the world is so that you can maximize your agency in that world and intervening in it. And so I thank Vijay very much for his contributions and for the others involved in organizing this. And I look forward to continuing to celebrate the lives of Lenin and his actuality.
Okay. Before moving forward, I will take a moment and acknowledge that this event we are basically co-hosting this event with Critical Theory Workshop, and I would like to thank Professor Gabriel Rockhill and the Critical Theory Workshop for doing this jointly with us. So I would like to ask Professor Suchetana Chattopadhyay, the director of the Marxian Study Center, for the concluding comments.
Thank you, Shondip, for moderating this. And I would like to thank Vijay for this insightful lecture. Though you were obviously so ill, you could still, continue in your usual energetic spirit and help us to understand many, many pressing issues of the day in the light of a Leninist perspective. I would also like to thank Gabriel for the time he has given us and for co-hosting this with us. I hope there will be more of these sessions in future. And finally, I would also like to thank the friend of our center, Chirosri Dashgupta, for her remarks and the questions that she asked. So I would like to apologize to the audience because we are running out of time. Many of you, especially young people, you have been so eager to hear Vijay speak, and you have so many questions. But unfortunately, we have to close this session now. So what we will do is what Shondip has suggested. Please send us your questions, and we will forward them to both Vijay and Gabriel. And when we receive answers from them, and I'm sure there will be nuanced reply. They will reply in a nuanced way. We will forward their replies to you. So please do that. And please join us again in the future because we will be organizing more talks in future. And I hope it will be possible for us to accommodate your questions sort of in a more direct way in the future sessions that we organize. I will now hand over the mic to Shondip.
Thank you, Suchetana. Thank you, Vijay. Thank you, Gabriel. It's an honor to have both of you and this wonderful talk about this great revolutionary the world has ever seen, I would say. And thank you, Chirosri, as well, for your questions and comments. And thank you all for joining us today. We will continue this online lecture series further throughout the year, and we will let you know about our future plans and everything. And we will keep collaborating with Critical Theory Workshop. Vijay, we recorded this session. We are going to publish this session in different platforms. I hope you don't mind. Okay, wonderful. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We will see you later. Good morning, good night, good afternoon again. Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.